Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Everybody loves to watch the wild horses out on the range. If you get a chance to see it, it's thrilling. But it's a serious situation. They've been out on the range for centuries, but they've only been managed since 1971 with the passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act. When that act was passed, they set a reasonable limit of 27,000 horses on the range. Today that number is 86,000. So it presents a problem not only for the health of the horses, but for the health of the range. There are some new tools, and we're going to discuss those today. Let's start with a little bit of background.
The can has been kicked down the road for years, and now there is an emergency situation out on the range that threatens much more than the wild horse. The Bureau of Land Management is charged with management of wild horses to keep herd sizes at the appropriate management level, or AML. As populations continue to grow, they need to gather horses, which are later put up for adoption, turned over to long-term holding, or treated with fertility controls and released back on the range, all at a cost to the taxpayer. It's a complex wildlife issue where the horses have very few, if any, predators, and their population can double every 5 years. There's also the issue of the rangeland itself, which is home to a variety of wildlife, but is coming up short with too many mouths to feed, particularly with the ongoing drought. Then there is a layer of bureaucracy. These are public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or the Forest Service, with a mission for multiple use. And finally, it's an emotional issue, especially in key herd management areas like the Onaqui herd, west of Tooele, where the horses are easily visible, and hence, people have made strong connections with that herd. 300 horses are to be removed from this HMA to return the population of wild horses to the appropriate management level of about 200 animals.
There's about 500 animals out here right now. We're looking at gathering 400 of those, roughly, and then we're going to sort through and bring back 100. So that's going to leave over 200 animals on the range that if we complete the gather like we're hoping, we should be really close to our upper end of appropriate management level. And we feel if we get there through the use of fertility control and maybe some small bait trapping, we can maintain that appropriate management level.
The BLM gathered 435 wild horses between July 14th and the 18th. We returned to the HMA a few weeks after the gather with Utah State University and students in their 4-H program to look at the range and talk about wild horses and their impact on the area.
We're spotting them on a water source, and so horses are pretty notorious for staying pretty close to water. So we're within that range that they stay within water, and you can really see the impact that they have on the vegetation and on the conditions of that vegetation around. You can see trails made, you can see fecal matter left, so they've been in here pretty heavily. There's a lot of things that go into it: the soil, the precip, the elevation, and then what's being utilized and how it's being utilized. We're looking at kind of the whole ecosystem, trying to make it a sustainable process so that they understand and gain an appreciation that the wild horses have a place, but there's a limit to their place in terms of what the land resource can support. I think it's important that we educate this generation about the value of public land and public land management, and that our agencies, our federal agencies, are given the task of managing this land for multiple uses and not just one single use. And so when you start factoring that in to their mission and to their responsibilities, it becomes a very, very complicated issue.
There is hope with the Onaqui HMA that having a population closer to AML may be manageable with fertility control rather than these larger roundups. A wild horse population that isn't over AML will have less impact on the land, and a better understanding among our future leaders about how complex these systems are will lead to better land management decisions. For the county seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
The recent gather at Onaqui only affects about 500 horses on a range that should have 200. There's still the other 86,000 across the nation, and they're growing at the rate of about 20% a year. Birth control seems to be the best tool we have available, and that's where we'll focus our conversation when we come back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking today about wild horses, a final update for this show, or a most recent update on the things that are taking place. There has been a lot of movement in the last little while, and we're going to talk about some of the, quote, technology behind it. Joining us for our conversation is Carl Hoops. He is an equine extension specialist for Utah State University, and also joining us in studio is Chris Davies, who is the veterinarian what is your title again?
I'm a veterinary immunologist.
Immunologist, that was the phrase I was looking for. Joining us remotely is Celeste Carlisle, who's a biologist, and Stephanie Boyles-Griffin, who is with the Humane Society of the United States. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation today. I would like to focus on the talk that's been going on about birth control. There are several things you can't do that are tied to funding as far as managing herd size, but there are some that you can talk about and can engage. And PZP has been the word that's been out there for a number of years, but there are also things such as Gonacon and Iuds, and there's been some real progress made on those. And for those of you who've been following this issue, it gives us a chance to talk about them. So let's kind of run through the list and talk about where we are with PZP and how it's proving to be effective on the range.
PZP has been, it's an immunocontraceptive vaccine that's been studied and applied in wild horse management situations for about, gosh, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, about 35 years. Mm-hmm. And because it has been utilized for such a long time and it has been so well studied, it really has this sort of gold standard reputation. And of course, it's not the end all be all. It does have to be boosted annually. That can be a challenge in some situations, obviously. There is a longer acting ZP protein vaccine called PZP22 that is being studied as well, and that will ostensibly allow for a longer acting PZP, as it were. And so the reason that you hear about this vaccine so much is that probably there's the most known about it in terms of the fertility control options for wild horses and burros. And also it has a long history of a real thought process behind it for ethical considerations when we're going to apply fertility control to an animal. And so over many, many years of wildlife fertility control conferences, which began in the late 70s and early 80s, there was real thought put behind if we were going to apply some type of fertility control. And these were days when people were starting to think, hey, maybe this is something that could be utilized for wild horses. There was a lot put into what are parameters that would be acceptable for implementing a fertility control to a wild horse or a burro. And they included things like very, very little behavioral change, would not affect a growing fetus, could be applied remotely. There's about 7 or 8 other parameters around that. And so that went into the development of the PZP vaccine. And so that, I think, is why it has so much trust and faith and frustration behind, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Had we been able to really implement this well, that would have been wonderful. And now that's exactly what we're looking at now. And some of the work that I know Stephanie and I are involved in is really looking at what are the challenges behind implementation, not just for PZP, but for implementing programmatic fertility.
There are some application challenges that one would think of as if you were to apply PZP, it's got to be boosted every year, which means you've got to go out and be able to find the same horse and get it captured or get it corralled off enough that you can dart it. And if you miss that, then the efficacy starts to wear off, and then you have kind of a false efficacy if you only can get 30% of the people re-inoculated with the booster shot. And so that seems to create a little bit of a problem. So Carl, I want you to talk a little bit about IUD. I mean, people think of really scary looking contraptions that can harm anatomies when they think of IUDs. What kind of progress are we making on that?
Well, that is definitely one of the aspects of the IUDs that we're trying to work with. And there's a current IUD that's out there that's being developed and being tested. I did bring an example of one of them. They are 3 magnets that are plastic coated that you insert vaginally and through the cervix of the mare. And then once they are inserted individually, they will form, and they form it all by themselves, kind of a triangle in shape. And this is just one of the forms. Obviously with IUDs, we're looking at several things that we're trying to overcome. First of all, do they stay in? A lot of the different IUDs that have been out there will fall out at different stages. Are they effective? And do they prevent pregnancy? And then one of the other things that we don't want them to cause any long-lasting effects or any adverse health effects to the horse. So currently we've been working just barely in the early stages. The ones that we've been working, it looks very promising, that they stay in very well, that they prevent pregnancy. But now we need to open it up. We need to move into some more field-like conditions. Right now, we've been working with domesticated horses.
At one point, the big talk was Gonacon, and I don't hear much about that anymore.
I mean, Gonacon is another, immunocontraceptive, but I think PZP has a lot of advantages over Gonacon. Gonacon attacks a hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus, and it has a lot more other physiological effects that we don't really want to see in a contraceptive vaccine. So I would personally argue that PZP is probably a better choice for an immunocontraceptive than Gonacon or an anti-gonadotropin releasing hormone type vaccine.
So Stephanie, as the person that has the Humane Society name behind your title and the concern for the well-being of the horses out on the range, what is your thought about these different approaches as far as when we're in the field of contraception?
Right. So, I think Celeste touched on PZP 22. One of the things that I think people may not realize is one of the most extensive studies that was done on PZP 22, and to explain what that is. So PZP 22 is a PZP vaccine preparation that adds a set of 3 time-release pellets to facilitate a successful delivery. So it's designed to provide multiple years of contraception with a single treatment. And a study was done on the Cedar Mountain herd, actually there in Utah. And not only were they able to show that they could get multiple year treatment after one inoculation, they got even better contraception and longer contraception after giving one initial booster 2 to 3 years after the contraception was applied. The other really important fact about that study is that they were able to recapture and retreat a high proportion of their previously treated mares. There are folks that are under the assumption that once you capture a mare, they become so wary of getting captured again that you would not be able to boost them. And that was not the case at Cedar Mountains, which is one of the reasons why PZP 22 is a really good option for situations where you're not going to be able to access that mare once a year. You're only going to be able to access her maybe every 2 to 3 years. The other thing I would add is, we at HSUS see the limitations of PZP 22 as well. We think there are improvements that can be made, which is why we're working in partnership with Purdue University to develop what we're calling the next generation PZP, which would be producing a vaccine with one shot, multiple year efficacy more like 3 to 5 years as opposed to 2 to 3. So we believe a longer acting formulation would mean fewer vaccines over the course of an animal's life, and then offering the important time and cost benefits for federal agencies like the BLM that, as I said, for some of these animals that live in these rugged, remote, vast areas of states like Utah, you're going to need something that's going to be effective for 3 to 5 years.
One question about the PZP 22. My understanding is that can't be delivered by DART, that you have to actually inject it into the mares. Is that correct?
No, it can be delivered by DART. In fact, they developed a special DART that allows both the liquid vaccine and all 3 time-release pellets to be applied remotely. Yes. But in Cedar Mountains, they did inject those animals by hand simply because they had to gather them anyway. So they chose to remotely, or to go ahead and hand inject. But yes, it can be delivered remotely. We do it with wild horses and with urban deer in the Northeast.
Right.
So I think we've got a good basis for understanding what what these tools are. I would like to when we come back, talk about some of the challenges of getting them to practically work in the field. So we're going to take a quick break, and we will come back with this conversation. Thank you for hanging with us here. This is an important topic. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation today about the progress being made in managing the horse herds and how we might finally have a chance of turning the curb on overpopulation of the range. I would like to take a little time to just talk about the range itself. If we don't get a handle on this, what's the future of the range going to look like?
You know, clearly with overpopulation, we see degradation of the conditions of the range. You know, some of the environmental challenges we have, like climate change and drought, wildfires also contribute to degradation of the range. You know, we've got a variety of wildlife species that live on the range and require it for their survival. And, you know, the challenge for us as humans is to manage that resource to the benefit of all of the species that need that for survival.
Do you think sometimes that's the problem that happens, is that people get so focused on, you know, their team in the league that they forget that there are other teams that also have needs? That might not be the best analogy.
I would agree that there's a lot of different species out there. There's a lot of people utilizing the range. There's a lot of different, you know, we all have our favorite, like you say. We all want to focus either on wildlife or we focus on deer and elk. And we tend to forget that a lot of different people are using the range, that a lot of different animals require that for survival. And when one species becomes so dominant and so they're taking up all of the resources, then we forget about everything else.
I refer back to that one shot that we recently encountered where there were horses kind of standing on a water supply and they were running the antelope off. This just happened quite recently. So.
And that's a common problem with horses, is that they tend to protect the water sources and not allow other animals to access them.
On that same sort of topic, I think part of what can happen to help facilitate a sort of more equilateral conversation about the uses on our public lands and where we have issues is that the agencies that manage our public lands don't necessarily have wonderful relationships with all of the stakeholders and users, and that a lot of the work that needs to be done in developing trust and transparency and why and how decisions are made can go a long way in helping people to understand the complexity and the layering of an ecosystem. And if our choices to manage that ecosystem are based in protection of habitat, as opposed to calling out any one of those individual uses or animals, that goes a long way towards the trust that's necessary for the American people to sort of trust in these agencies to manage things without a special interest attached to it.
The mood, because I don't obviously make all of the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Council confabs, but I've been to a couple of them, and I have seen a move in their attitude and how people who once were very opposed to doing anything with the animals have a different, they've had a change of heart. Do you feel, Celeste, we're moving in the right direction enough?
I think it was 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago, that there were real concerted efforts among various organizations and among Congress as well to just say, it's time for us to figure this out across the aisle, so to speak. And those conversations between seemingly very divergent stakeholders have begun. And that has shifted the tone for sure. Developing these relationships with people we may have traditionally been at loggerheads with has been incredibly meaningful and has allowed the conversation to move beyond that sort of push and pull that we all can get into and just sort of defending our positions, and in moving to a place where we can actually hear some of the real layered complexity that surrounds this issue and surrounds people that are involved in this issue.
We'll be right back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. Gosh, this half hour's just disappeared, but we want to leave a little time for closing thoughts. Celeste, we'll start with you.
I just think we need as many heads in the room as possible, that the answers are out there and we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. We need to, as trite as it seems, we do absolutely need to work together.
Stephanie?
Yeah, and I would echo some of what Celeste said. We need everyone in the room working together. There are a lot of stakeholders that care about the land and the animals, all of the animals, wild horses, wild grazers, and domestic grazers. And what we've been doing in the past hasn't been working. And that's one of the reasons a group of stakeholders began trying to work together that came from different perspectives. And I think we're making progress for the horses and the land by doing that, as opposed to constantly fighting with one another over how to manage these animals in a humane and sustainable way.
Well, my thoughts just to close is that I'm excited for the future. I am excited for the new generations to come in. We need their input. We need their imagination, and we need their ideas. And I'm excited that we'll be able to figure it out.
Well, I think we're clearly making progress in terms of opening up the discussion and getting better relationships between the different constituency groups. Fertility control is definitely a key element of managing the wild horse population. And what we need is longer acting contraceptives. So, longer acting PZP, IUDs, things that will provide, 3 to 5 years or longer fertility control. And that's the direction I think we're moving in.
Well, thank you all for your comments. I would like to add that this is a conversation that you at home are going to have to take a little bit of time and seek out the answers to and stay on top of. If we're going to solve the problem of the range, we do have to think outside the box in the areas of contraception and adoption and how we process them, because the cost of doing this is just continually going up and up and up. And at some point, it will break the BLM's back financially to be able to juggle things without some really good, viable solutions. Thanks for tuning into the county seat. Remember, local life, local government is where your life happens, and that's what we try and cover here each and every week of the last 11 years. So remember to stay involved and stay engaged, and we'll see you next week on the county seat. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.